Good morning. Today, the Justice Department is announcing charges in a significant national security cyber matter. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Washington, the National Security Division have charged 2 Chinese hackers working with the Chinese Ministry of State Security, including the Guangdong State Security Department, GSSD, of the MSS, with a sweeping global computer intrusion campaign. In making this announcement, I'm joined today by Dave Bowditch, Deputy Director of the FBI, Bill Hislop, U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Washington, and Raymond Duda, Special Agent in charge of the FBI's Seattle Field Division. The campaign targeted intellectual property and confidential business information held by the private sector, including COVID-19 related treatment, testing, and vaccines. The hackers also targeted the online accounts of non-government organizations and individual dissidents, clergy, and democratic and human rights activists in the United States, China, and Hong Kong. Targeted industries included high-tech manufacturing, medical device, civil and industrial engineering, business, educational, and gaming software, solar energy, pharmaceuticals, and defense. According to the indictment, these malicious cyber activities began more than 10 years ago and were ongoing as of the date of the indictment. During that time, the hackers stole terabytes of data from hundreds of targets, establishing themselves as a prolific threat to U.S. and foreign networks. The activities outlined in the indictment are concrete examples of 2 concerning trends. First, and one we've seen for some time, China is using cyber intrusions as part of its rob, replicate, and replace strategy to technological development. Second, and one that is perhaps less appreciated by the public and international partners, China is providing a safe haven for criminal hackers who, as in this case, are hacking in part for their own personal gain, but willing to help the state and on call to do so. As the indictment shows, the hackers targeted technology companies in countries with high technology industries, including in Australia, Belgium, Germany, Japan, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Spain, South Korea, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and here in the United States. These intrusions are yet another example of China's brazen willingness to engage in theft through computer intrusions contrary to their international commitments, such as their 2015 understanding with the United States and similar understandings with other countries not to conduct or knowingly support cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property, including trade secrets or other confidential business information, with the intent of providing a competitive advantage to Chinese companies or commercial sectors. Unsurprisingly, the intrusions targeted industries outlined in the Made in China 2025 plan. China's 10-year plan for targeting strategic advanced technology manufacturing industries for development. While the plan calls for an innovation-driven approach, cases like this one show it is as much a roadmap to theft as it is a guide to innovation. The intrusions in this case targeted 8 of 10 of the technology sectors identified in the plan: next-generation information technology, robotics and automated machine tools, aircraft and aircraft components, maritime vessels and marine engineering equipment, clean energy vehicles, new materials, biotechnology, and advanced rail. The indictment specifically outlines how stealing intellectual property from the companies in these high-tech industries can help Chinese companies replicate the targeted technology and eventually edge out their non-Chinese competitors. For example, from one target, a Maryland technology and manufacturing firm, the defendants obtained competitive business intelligence in the form of testing mechanisms and results, product composition, manufacturing processes, and supply chain data that would have revealed to competitors what products the firm was intending to bring to the market. The same stolen information would have allowed competitors to save on research and development costs and time. Concrete example, thereby providing them with a competitive advantage in the global marketplace. Concrete examples of stolen research and development data include a Massachusetts pharmaceutical company which suffered the theft of the chemical structure of and the engineering processes for anti-infective agents, and a California pharmaceutical company which suffered the theft of the chemical structure of and testing data for the treatment for a common chronic disease. The business context for some of these intrusions is also noteworthy. For example, one target, a Massachusetts medical device engineering company, saw the defendants steal source code and algorithms at or about the time it had sought to protect such data from a Chinese firm with which it had partnered to produce device compounds. China's anti-competitive behavior and flagrant disregard for their promises not to engage in cyber-enabled intellectual property theft is not just a domestic issue, it is a global issue. The indictment alleges activity against companies in at least 10 countries around the world. The indictment shows very clearly that no country is immune. Any country with a successful company or industry must be on guard and prepared to protect itself. The indictment also highlights how the Chinese government is willing to turn a blind eye to prolific criminal hackers operating within its borders. Although the indictment alleges the defendants conducted activity on behalf of the MSS, some of the defendants' alleged criminal activities were conducted for their personal profit. For example, in one instance, defendant Lee is alleged to have emailed a target and threatened to expose the target's stolen source code on the internet unless he was paid $15,000 in cryptocurrency. In this manner, China has now taken its place alongside Russia, Iran, and North Korea in that shameful club of nations that provide a safe haven for cyber criminals in exchange for those criminals being on call for the benefit of the state. Here, to feed the Chinese Communist Party's appetite for American and other non-Chinese companies' hard-earned intellectual property, including COVID-19 research. With the top cover provided by state officials, these criminals are given free rein to victimize law-abiding citizens around the world. All of these activities, state-sponsored theft of intellectual property, and knowingly providing a safe haven for cyber criminals, run afoul of norms of acceptable behavior in cyberspace, which the international community must address. These charges reflect the department's continued determination and ability to hold individuals and nations accountable for cyber-enabled crimes. In addition to disrupting the activities of a group that was not being tracked as an organized threat by the private sector, we hope the indictment will raise broader awareness of China's malicious cyber activity. We're grateful for the willingness of our international law enforcement partners to cooperate with us in the investigation and disruption of cyber threats. This is yet another example of how like-minded countries can stand together to counter malicious state-sponsored cyber activities, and we're appreciative of the statements that are going to be made by several of these countries in the coming hours. Before I turn this over to Dave Bowditch, I'd like to thank all the tremendous work done by the agents at the FBI Spokane Resident Agency and the San Antonio Field Office that led the investigation. The many FBI agents and professionals in FBI Cyber Division, in Norfolk and in Portland who provided essential assistance, the FBI's legal attachés and cyber assistant legal attachés stationed around the world who led the coordination with our foreign partners, and the prosecutors in Spokane and here in the National Security Division. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Good morning. As Director Wray said in his recent speech at the Hudson Institute, the greatest long-term threat to our nation's information, intellectual property, and its economic vitality is the counterintelligence and economic espionage threat from China. China is determined to use every means at its disposal, including the theft of intellectual property from U.S. companies, its laboratories, and our universities to degrade the United States' economic, technological, and military advantages. The scale and scope of the hacking activity sponsored by the PRC intelligence services against the U.S. and our international partners is unlike any other threat we're facing today. But China's hacking of foreign companies to benefit Chinese state-owned enterprises is only part of their playbook. We're bringing these charges today to put the Chinese leaders directing these cyber attacks on notice. There are serious consequences and risks for stealing our technological and our intellectual property. Even as we stand here today, China is facing degradation of its image on the world stage as a trusted partner. Other nations partnering with China in economic development projects should closely consider their alliances with a country that has so little regard for international law. These hackers, directed by the Chinese intelligence services, have targeted and continue to target companies and laboratories in countries throughout the world. China uses its economic influence to pressure those countries not to publicly expose or to challenge their illegal actions. China steals intellectual property and research which bolsters its economy. And then they use that illicit gain as a weapon to silence any country that would dare challenge their illegal actions. This type of economic coercion is not what we expect from a trusted world leader. It is what we expect from an organized criminal syndicate. Cybercrime is a major threat to our national security, and it's growing each and every day. At the FBI, we're tackling this problem the same way we've successfully addressed other types of crimes throughout our history, through deterrence. And we're doing that by identifying the perpetrators of cybercrimes and making every effort to hold them accountable to the rule of law. Through investigation and attribution, our cyber division investigators, our special agents, analysts, and linguists, and our assistant United States attorneys throughout the country impose those consequences, not just on the hackers themselves, but also on the individuals and the institutions directing those hackers and facilitating those actions. Indictments are just one way we do that. I am proud of the tenacity of the FBI agents and their counterparts, whether they be analysts, linguists, or otherwise, as well as the assistant United States attorneys who doggedly pursued these perpetrators. By indicting Dong and Li, we're condemning their actions and those of the MSS officers at the Guangdong State Security Department who provided them material support and direction. Unfortunately, China does not just use its hackers to target R&D or intellectual property. As we demonstrate in the indictment, China is also willing to use their intelligence services' cyber capabilities to target Chinese dissidents, which are outside of China, and protesters supporting democracy and human rights in Hong Kong. I want to make one important point, which is the same one I've made many times before. Our concern is not with the Chinese people or the Chinese Americans. Our concern is with the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. Confronting this threat effectively does not mean we should not do business with China. It does not mean we should not host Chinese students or welcome Chinese visitors or coexist with China as a country on the world stage. It does mean that when China violates criminal laws and international norms, we will not tolerate it. We're going to hold them accountable. We'll use our unique authorities, our experiences, and our capabilities with the help of our partners both at home and abroad to fight this threat each and every day. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Bill Hislop, the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Washington. The cybercrime occurring here was first discovered on computers of the Department of Energy's Hanford site in the Eastern District of Washington. As the grand jury charged, the computer systems of many multiple businesses, individuals, and agencies across the globe have been the target of this scheme. That's both throughout the United States and worldwide. Computer systems have been hacked, have been compromised, and there's been a huge array of sensitive and valuable trade secrets, technology, data, information, personal individual information have been stolen. The hackers operated from China, both for their own gain and with the assistance and the benefit of the Chinese government's Ministry of State Security. Defendants Li and Dong are both residents of China. They were educated there in the computer application technology together. They went to school at the University of Electronic Science and Technology in Chengdu. They've been operating for multiple years in China. They've been hacking for their own personal gain and stealing the technology of others. They have been hacking for the benefit of China's Ministry of State Security. The cybercrime hacking that occurred here was first discovered by a firm who served and had a relationship with the Hanford site, the Department of Energy site in the Eastern District of Washington, and the FBI was advised. DOE's Hanford site computer system was touched by this and was invaded by this. But they stole only less than a gigabyte from Hanford's network and from its personnel. Ultimately, as shown on page 11 of the indictment, there are multiple victims in the United States that have occurred over the years. We have named 13, and there are 12 international victims, but the total of victims of what has occurred here is in the hundreds. The victims, as Assistant Attorney General Demir said, include high-tech manufacturing, civil, industrial, and medical device engineering firms, business, educational, and gaming software development, solar energy, pharmaceutical, and most recently, they have gone after the vulnerabilities, if they can find them, in networks of biotech and other firms known for COVID vaccines, treatments, and testing technology. As recent as January of 2020, they were doing reconnaissance in a Massachusetts firm involved in COVID vaccine research. Likewise, they did the same for a Maryland firm involved in biotech research and looking for a COVID vaccine. In February of 2020, a biotech firm was invaded that is involved in antiviral work regarding COVID, and they were located in California. And most recently, on May 12, 2020, they sought vulnerabilities in another California firm doing diagnostic work dealing with COVID test kits. There are literally hundreds of millions of dollars worth of trade secrets, intellectual property, and other valuable information that has been stolen. As I said earlier, they have done this partially for their own personal gain, it would appear, but also for the obvious interest of the People's Republic of China's Ministry of State Security. And there they have looked at defense contractors in the United States and abroad involved in satellite programs, military wireless networks and communication systems, high-powered microwave and laser systems, counter-chemical weapon systems, and ship-to-helicopter integration systems. They have also sought and, in some cases, obtained personal data such as passwords for email accounts for Chinese dissidents, the information for a Hong Kong community organizer, the pastor of a Christian church in China, and that occurred just before that church was banned. A dissident and former Tiananmen Square protester, emails between dissidents and the office of the Dalai Lama, a pastor in Chengdu, emails of a U.S. professor and organizer, emails of 2 Canadian residents advocating for freedom and democracy in Hong Kong. And these are examples. This prosecution and this indictment that was returned recently by the grand jury in the Eastern District of Washington is occurring as a result of the combined, unwavering efforts of the National Security Division here at the Department of Justice, of the attorneys and staff of the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Washington, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, whose staff and personnel are absolutely superlative. Together, we seek justice for these victims and others affected by this unlawful activity, and we intend to prosecute these defendants for their alleged crimes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning. I'm Raymond Duda, Special Agent in charge of the FBI Seattle Field Office. Today marks an important step in the FBI's efforts to combat what Director Wray commented is the greatest long-term threat to the United States intellectual property. The indictment unsealed today is the result of a multi-year investigation and represents some of the finest work the FBI is doing to counter the cyber threat posed by China. The intrusion set described in the indictment has long been considered one of the most prolific group of hackers we've investigated. The 2 defendants have been using their technical expertise to hack computer networks for years. They have been able to gain access to networks around the world encompassing victims in business, government, and academia. The value of the information and intellectual property stolen by these defendants totals in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The investigation of these 2 men was extremely complicated. These individuals took steps to conceal their actions to make it more difficult for victims and law enforcement to recognize and identify their nefarious activities. They researched potential victims ahead of time, frequently using an application called China Chopper, an application frequently used by hackers in China, and were able to gain unauthorized access into victims' networks. In one instance, as was mentioned, the defendants brazenly attempted to extort a victim company, something rarely seen when investigating state actors. The information and intellectual property stolen was not always for their own personal gain. In many instances, the defendants were targeting organizations which were of direct interest to the government of China. These included technology, engineering, and defense companies, as well as the biotech firm who is known to be working on a vaccine for COVID-19. This case highlights the efforts being taken by the FBI and our partners to counter the threat posed by China to the economic and national security of the United States. It also demonstrates the FBI's commitment to protect our nation and sends a message that, as Director Wray mentioned just 2 weeks ago, when China violates our criminal laws and international norms, we're not going to tolerate it. Thank you very much.
Operator, please open the line for questions.
We will now begin the question and answer session. To ask a question, you may press star then 1 on your touch-tone phone. If you are using a speakerphone, please pick up your handset before pressing the keys. To withdraw your question, please press star then 2. When you pose your question, please note which speaker you'd like to direct it to. Our first question today will come from Pete Williams with NBC News.
Thank you, Mr. Demers. You all have said, and the indictment says, that the hackers researched vulnerabilities in biotech firms that were working on the COVID vaccines and treatments. is it your contention that they actually obtained any?
We, in this indictment, we don't allege that they obtained that information. We do know that they were looking to obtain it by their computer intrusion activity, but we don't allege that here.
And can you say why, if the indictment was dated July 7th, we're just hearing about it today?
Well, with an indictment like this, obviously has to be deconflicted, and we have to prepare, obviously, to do a press conference like this, especially in the days of coronavirus. So it's nothing more than other things that were going on, and making sure that everyone who needed to be aware of this, including our international partners, were aware of this before we did it.
Our next question comes from Eric Tucker with the Associated Press.
Hi, this question is for John or anyone else who wants to take it. You mentioned a little bit about the notion that these two hackers were in it for their own personal profit, but also directed or sponsored by intelligence service and the government there. Can you talk a little bit more in more detail about the nature of that relationship and how that worked and what the connection was?
Well, as I said, thanks, Erica, this is something we've seen in cases involving Russia, Iran, and North Korea, where basically criminal hackers are given safe harbor because they're also doing work, on behalf of the intelligence services of a country here, the MSS. So you can see by a variety of the hacks that they did, of the computer intrusion activity they did, how they were being directed by the government. Obviously, extorting somebody for cryptocurrency is not something that the government is usually interested in, but nor are criminal hackers usually interested in human rights activists and clergymen, et cetera. So you could see what we call this blended threat in cyber vocabulary. I don't know, David, if anyone else wanted to say something.
Again, if you would like to ask a question, you can press star 1 now to join the queue. Our next question will come from Aruna Viswanathan with the Wall Street Journal.
Hi, thanks. I have two quick questions. One, you mentioned that the COVID research wasn't actually taken. Was there any sense that it did slow down or limit research in any way by these companies? And two, can you talk about why you decided to unseal it now versus waiting to see if these defendants might travel and you can pick them up? And do you expect these other countries that also have victim companies to file parallel cases against these two hackers?
Thanks, Rita. So on the first, what we worry about, and I don't want to go beyond the indictment for what we saw in this case, but obviously this is just one of several instances of what we see in terms of trying to hack coronavirus information. We are concerned that that the hacking or even the attempted hacking of that information can slow down the research. Because what happens, especially if you do have a breach, obviously, is people's attention needs to be focused on remediating that breach and also ensuring that the data that had been collected up to that point and the findings that are made, et cetera, are still have the integrity that they had before the breach. Once someone is in your system, they can not only take the data, they can manipulate the data. And so what you've got to really focus on at that point is making sure, whether through backup or other systems, that nothing has changed about your data. And so we do worry to that extent that there could be a slowdown in the research efforts of that particular institution. In terms of why we would unseal now, this is a question that we always ask ourselves in these cases, and ultimately the question is, do we think that there's a chance that these two individuals are going to be traveling anytime in the foreseeable future to somewhere where we can arrest them? In this case, and in cases where we do unseal the indictment, we have decided that that's unlikely. and therefore that there's more value to unsealing this indictment, to highlight for the public, for the private sector generally, the problems, the threats that are facing them, to encourage them, of course, to come forward and work with the FBI, as most of the target companies in this indictment did, to their benefit and to the Bureau's benefit, and that those gains are worth more than waiting for somebody to travel in the unforeseeable future. And then finally, in terms of the other countries that we're engaged in, each country has its own criminal justice system and its own approach to these cases. Obviously, we saw the Germans announce charges in a cyber intrusion case, in that case of the German parliament. We were very heartened to see that, and we do plan to work with countries who might be planning on doing that. But, that's ultimately a decision for each country to make.
Our next question comes from Caitlin Knapp with KXLY.
Hi, this question is for the U.S. Attorney for Eastern District of Washington. Did these defendants ever travel to the Tri-Cities to go to Hanford, or was everything done in China? And talk to me about how vital it was for these charges to be filed in Eastern Washington, because I don't recall something ever like this happening here.
Several people have said, why Eastern Washington? It's a part of the country that many of us love very, very deeply, but you don't necessarily expect to see a case like this coming out of there. On the other hand, if it can occur there, we all must know it can occur anywhere. And in this indictment, you see activity by these individuals worldwide. So everyone has to always be vigilant. In this particular case, this case started because of an intrusion into the Hanford computer system. And as a result of that and work with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, it was then learned that what these individuals were doing was much broader. And ultimately, as I said earlier, there are hundreds and hundreds of victims in the United States and worldwide. The intrusion into the Hanford computer system, if you look in the indictment, you will find a chart of the U.S. victims that are listed there with a brief description of the scope or the type of information that was obtained and the quantity of information. Albeit that the Hanford system, it was less than a gigabyte of information. We also know that they came back in 2018, as alleged in the indictment, and tried to intrude again, but were unable to do so. And we know that in several instances, these individuals came back, sometimes years later, to firms that they had tried to hack the first time. But that is the connection between the Eastern District of Washington and the Hanford site. A relatively small intrusion, but nonetheless a criminal, very important hack, and that was the beginning that has led to this massive scheme being investigated and uncovered. And I also want to pay homage to the people at Hanford who have worked very closely with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as have a number of the other victims here, to find if they have vulnerabilities in their systems, to stop those vulnerabilities. And anyone who is involved with high-tech and computer systems know that this is a continuing, ongoing effort. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has been great in working with these victims and helping them to plug those holes when they occur and to stop this.
Our final question comes from Nick Schifrin with PBS NewsHour.
Thanks very much. This is for John or anyone who wants to take it. On your comment that the PRC is providing a safe haven to hackers, we've seen in the past you're indicting Chinese hackers, I believe, but is that different, or is this somehow different than previous indictments? And why only indict hackers rather than their MSS handlers, whom the indictment mentions are known to the grand jury? Thanks.
Right. So this is different in the sense that we're not just indicting them for their criminal activity, but we're indicting them for the activity that they also did on behalf of the state. And it is the first time that we're announcing charges that present what we call this blended threat of criminal hackers also doing state-sponsored activities and being allowed to do their criminal activities and profit off those criminal activities by the state because they can be on call to the state to do its work as well. So that is the first time that we are charging this. We've obviously charged multiple cases of just the criminal side. We've charged multiple cases of the state-sponsored intelligence officers, not just state-sponsored, state-directed intelligence officers or People's Liberation Army officers. But this is the first time that we're charging the case in this way. As for why we didn't charge the MSS officers, I don't really like to talk about people we didn't charge. We follow the principles of federal prosecution. We follow, obviously, the admissible non-classified evidence in terms of indictments where it goes. And in this case, following those principles, we decided that the best thing to do was to ask the grand jury to indict these two individuals. Thanks to everybody. Thanks very much.
This concludes the formal portion of the press conference. For media wishing to stay on for the